Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is. I do hope that you're having a good time. This is part of a series of flips on academic writing, and let's go ahead and get started. So this week's task is we're going to review the definition of a thesis statement, then we're going to review what distinguishes a good thesis statement from a bad thesis statement, and finally we'll learn how to turn a thesis statement into a basic argument. We've already done several flips. One looked at selecting a topic, another identifying key themes in the topic, and a couple of flips were devoted to helping you to produce a good thesis statement. In this flip, we want to take that thesis statement and develop an argument for the thesis statement. In future flips, we'll look at how to turn that into an outline, how to draft the paper, how to revise the introduction and the conclusion, and how to edit the paper. But this time, our main focus is just making a very basic argument. You don't even have to use very many words. From previous flips, you know that a thesis is a statement, which is the ultimate conclusion of an argument. A statement must be true or false. A thesis statement must be something that is not a mere fact, can be argued, and must be argued. This means that it's something that is not well accepted. Other rules that we looked at. It should be strong. Thesis statements are different than factual statements, so we don't want to say things like this paper attempts to prove high taxes are a bad idea. Instead, we would say this paper proves that high taxes are a bad idea. Again, this paper would like to suggest that English education is poor in Japan. Instead, English education is poor in Japan for 3 reasons. So we don't want to say things like would like to suggest. We want to just come straight out and say what we want to say. Also, we have to take a side. So if you said this paper argues that losing World War II is good and bad for Japan, that would not be a good thesis statement. Instead, you want to do something that shows that Japan benefited more by losing than it costs. So you have to take one side and not just be in the middle. Third, remember, a thesis statement is always a statement. It's never a question or a command. So we can't make a thesis statement, what are the different ways of evaluating intelligence? Instead, we have to say something like this. Despite popular claims to the contrary, academics have found there is only one way to measure intelligence. Now remember, I'm not saying that this is actually a true statement. I'm saying this would make a good thesis statement. Fourth, use the active, not the passive voice when making your thesis statement. So instead of the economy was seen to have grown based on the increase in GDP, state this actively. The increase in GDP showed that the economy grew by 37%. Now remember, it should not be something that is a mere fact. Western academic writing always tries to say something interesting. A mere fact is not interesting. The goal is to produce a statement that tells us something interesting about one of the themes in the topic, or about the relationship between 2 themes inside of the general topic that we're writing on. Now, the goal is to write a short argument. Each of your supporting claims, so let's say 2, 3, and 4, should be claims that address potential weaknesses in your thesis. Your thesis must be argued because it is not a well-accepted fact and you're taking a side. In other words, some people disagree with your thesis statement. This means that you need to address, which means to answer or to rebut, their objections, doubts, and critiques. In order to answer these in your paper's argument, first you need to guess the objections based on possible weaknesses of your thesis statement. Once you have a thesis statement, you need to build an argument to support this by thinking about weaknesses and then the defenses against these weaknesses. One key area where this happens is terms. Undefined terms are weaknesses. For every term, make sure it has a clear definition. So some things have pretty easy definitions. So if I am not a botanist, if I'm writing about plants, I would pretty much be able to say they're the green things that grow on their own that use photosynthesis. If I'm a botanist, maybe I need to say a lot more. Maybe I need a much clearer definition of what it is to be a plant. Other words are always going to need definitions. Things like best. We need to have some criteria that we're using to determine what's best. Second place where weaknesses can come about is the form. We could say the structure here as well. Unclear or illogical argumentation are weaknesses. Both of these things are things that will make your argument much worse. So then we have to ask, is it a logical argument? This means, do the premises support the conclusions and occur in an easy to follow order? By easy to follow, I mean easy for your reader to understand. Are they clear? This means, are they concise, consistent, concrete? We also want to check the truth of the argument that we're raising. Have we shown that the premises for the argument that we're making are true? This third one will not be the main emphasis of this flip. That's mostly a question for what happens during your research and a little bit further in the writing process. But here we want to identify what are the things that we need to show are true in order to make our argument work. So for each of these theses, the argument hinges on one or more definitions. Until these are defined, these are big weaknesses. So, thesis statement. Toyota's logo should not be bright red because people associate this color with fire and loss. So we need to answer, what does bright red mean here? What exactly does that cover? Is every shade of red bright? Are some shades bright and other shades not bright? What does associate mean? What sort of a connection does it take before we say two things are associated? Another thesis statement. Even though French food uses less oil than Italian food, it is less healthy due to the use of butter. Here there's one really big question, and the question is healthy. We're going to need to give a lot of information so we can figure out what makes something healthy or not healthy, and it's going to be the main weakness in this claim. We might also want to define French food and Italian food. These may have more breadth than we might first think. Finally, here's the thesis that we actually did see in a class. Octopuses are aliens because they're unlike other life on the planet. In order to defend this thesis, you're going to need to define alien and unlike in very, very clear ways. In part because this is so different from what we normally would think. So, although we write the thesis statement at the top of the paper, we make an argument from top to bottom, putting the conclusion of that argument at the bottom. To be strong, the argument needs to have clearly defined major terms, state the major claims and relate them in a clear fashion, identify the general facts we need for these claims, and then we'll do research to validate those facts, whether that's an experiment or whether that's looking for data. And finally, we will reach our final conclusion, which is our thesis statement. So here are some common patterns. These are some very common types of major claims. One is kind of an A or B pattern. So you have something like taxes should go up or expenses should go down. Or you have something like acorns make oak trees or magic makes oak trees. So we give something where there's two options. Usually here we're going to pair this such that we get rid of one of the options. That's going to give us an answer. If C, then D. If fires are dangerous, people should not play around them. If prices go up, then the amount of consumption goes down. Here we have a condition, and if that condition is met, something will happen. So that's our claim. So this is also a key kind of claim, because if we can get the left side to be shown to be true, we'll be able to show the right side is true. Next one, not E. Internet access is not too expensive. The Earth is not the largest planet in the solar system. These will help us a lot with the sort of claims we're making at the top and also at the bottom. Let's look at a couple more. All K are M. Every chipmunk is a squirrel. Every cell phone uses electricity. Here we're making a category claim. We're saying everything in this category behaves in this way. Next, some N are P. Some squirrels are chipmunks. Some light bulbs work. So these are claims where we're saying at least one thing in this big category is the case. So some squirrels are not chipmunks. There are other types of squirrels. There's ezorisu, there's also flying squirrels, also ground squirrels other than chipmunks. Many, many kinds of animals are squirrels without being chipmunks. Similarly, some light bulbs are broken. Finally, two more categories. Some Q are not R. Some squirrels are not chipmunks. So among all the types of squirrels, as I was saying, some of them are not going to be chipmunks. So some are, some are not. So they're split into two groups of things. No SRW, no penguins are mammals. So this is another claim of this sort where we're working with categories. We're saying no thing that is a penguin is at the same time a mammal, because penguins are birds and no birds are mammals. So these are some of the basic patterns that you might see if you are making good arguments. There's one pattern that's extremely common. I use them, I'm sure that you will use them as well, but it's also dangerous. And that is this pattern. X is better than Y, or X is more efficient than Y. Let's illustrate the problem. So I'll give two questions that I'll give you a couple of seconds to work on. Which is better, a hammer or a dollar bill? Is a supercomputer or a pocket calculator more efficient? So perhaps in your head you're thinking of all of the ways that one of these objects is much, much better than the other object, or much, much more efficient. But let's think about that. The problem is that better only means something when we explain what it's better for. A hammer is great if I'm trying to nail something to the wall, but a dollar bill is much better at buying me water. A supercomputer is more efficient for doing very complex calculations and simulations, but a pocket calculator is more efficient for carrying around to do simple math. Conclusion: when using better or more efficient, you need to make very clear what use something is better for. So for instance, if I said which is better, a Mac or a PC, the answer is not as clear as I would want. So if I want a computer cheaply, obviously a PC is better. So if better here means cost me less money, probably a PC. If better means lets me do more of the research that I want to do, maybe the answer is a Mac, maybe it's a PC. That's a more complicated question. So there's a very similar pattern I want to mention to you as well. And that pattern is the use of the word should. So the question here is, should you use should when making claims? So this is the form of the claim: people should do Y, you should not do M, he should not do X, all of these claims. Should has a similar problem to better or more efficient. We need to be very clear about whether should means effective for a goal or means something like morally necessary. So let me just give a couple examples for each. So he should kick harder. Here it'd be better if we said he should kick harder if he wants to score from that distance, say in soccer. Or he should run more. Here do we mean he should run more because he would improve his performance for maybe playing an instrument? Do we mean he should run more because he's very unhealthy? Do we mean he should run more because he's doing something wrong or evil by not running? So moving to the other category, if we said you should not hurt people, here we probably mean it is wrong to hurt people. In this case, it's probably better to make it clear. So if you think that something should be done or should not be done, please be very clear about what you mean by the word should. So also, when we're looking at this, you can create weaknesses in another way. This mixes forms and terms. This particular problem relates to style that all of us are taught as native speakers and non-native speakers. So both native speakers and non-native speakers are taught to not repeat the same word. Instead, we are told to use different words that mean the same thing. This is usually good advice, but it turns into bad advice when you're writing academic papers for the terms you need to define. So looking at some of our earlier examples, if I define Italian food as pastas with tomato or Alfredo sauces, then I should not using Italian cuisine and Italian cooking in the paper as synonyms. That will not help my paper, that's just going to make things confusing. Are they exact synonyms? Do they mean exactly the same thing? Or is there some space that changes what they're doing? It's better just to stick with key terms always being the same term. With the Toyota example, if I define bright red, my paper becomes unclear if I sometimes use bright red, but other times use vermilion, crimson, scarlet, and cherry at different points in my paper and argument. Now, if I make clear exactly what's going on, that's a slightly different story, but for all of our key terms, we don't want to change them randomly. Every term we define, we want to use consistently throughout the paper. So, I want to work with some of the examples we looked at before. I've made maybe some very minor changes just to make them easier to work with. So last time you saw that this was a good thesis. Taking a 10-minute rest after 30 minutes of vocabulary learning, followed by another 30 minutes of vocabulary learning, improves word memorization by 11%. So I like this. It's a very clear thesis. Let's see what we can do to make an argument. So, we have 4 steps. Define every important term, state the major claims and relate them in a clear way, identify the general facts we need for these claims, and reach our final conclusion. So these are the 4 things we want to do to take this thesis and convert it into a short argument that we can make an outline from. So let's do that step by step. So let's define every important term. So we use the term vocabulary learning. We need to say, what will that activity be? So we're claiming there's something that's vocabulary learning. Does that mean that we're looking at a book and going through the list? Does that mean we're watching a PowerPoint that explains these things? Does that mean that we are doing like a chorus call? What does it mean? Word memorization. We need to ask, well, what counts as memorization? So I've seen students where if you give them 10 minutes and 50 words, they can give all 50 back to you with definitions. But if you ask them the same question the next week, nothing. We have to make clear what that means. Also, what is rest? So in that 10-minute period, what are they doing? Are they sleeping? Are they running around in circles in the room? We have to make all of this clear in order to not create these weaknesses. Second, state the major claims and relate them in a clear way. So up at the top, I just have here, we have these terms: word memorization, vocabulary learning, rest. Then at the bottom, we're going to say 30 minutes vocabulary learning plus 30 minutes vocabulary learning will give you X level of word memorization. 30 minutes vocabulary learning, 30 minutes vocabulary learning, 30 minutes of vocabulary learning, 10 minutes of rest, and another 30 minutes of vocabulary learning will give you Y level of this sort of word memorization. And then finally, we've got our conclusion. We want to show that we're going to get at least that 11% that we're hoping for. So this is the second step. Third step, we're going to identify the general facts we need for these claims. So we need to be able to show that you'll get X level from doing 30 minutes and 30 minutes, and Y level from 30 minutes plus 10 minutes rest plus 30 minutes of vocabulary learning. So we need to show that by comparing these two things and seeing what happens. Finally, we need to reach our final conclusion with this argument. So we need to show that if you take the amount with the rest, we're going to get our 11% versus if you take the amount without the rest. Alright, let's look at another example. So we saw this one last time. So this is another good thesis. Tuna is an endangered species due to overfishing. So institutions that manage marine resources in maritime countries should sign a treaty which imposes limits that prevent overfishing. So we started with a big topic, endangered species. We added several themes. We narrowed it to institutions. We narrowed it geographically. And we came up with a specific application. All of that helped to make this a strong thesis. So again, now we need to go through these steps. Define every important term. What will endangered mean? What level is this? According to who? Institutions that? Well, what institutions will count? Does a high school count? Is this only universities? Is this only major government entities? What counts as an institution that manages marine resources? Finally, what's overfishing? We'll have to define that term if we want this paper to have any merit. Again, we want to relate these terms and put them out in a clear way. So we're going to need to prove something. Since E is endangered because of overfishing, institutions should prevent O. So institutions should prevent overfishing. So now we have all these subclaims. So E because of O. We're saying it's endangered because it's overfished. We're going to have to support that somehow. We're saying it's overfished. And finally, we've got this big should claim. So let's see what we need to do. Some of these are factual claims, some of these are structural claims. So we're going to have to try and show that it's endangered because it's overfished, and also that it's overfished. This will depend on the definitions that we gave. Finally, we will have to show how this all connects to what we want to prove. So this is kind of a compound sentence, but I think we should put this at the bottom if we're making it into a good argument. We want to prove, since it's endangered because of overfishing, institutions should prevent overfishing. And we need to work on defining all of this and making sure our should is clear. So, another thing to worry about here, and this is a good check on your thesis statement, is remember, don't bite off more than you can chew. Let's think about octopuses are aliens, because they're unlike other life on the planet. This has a couple of good things going for it. First off, it's not a mere fact. Second off, it must be argued. This is not well accepted. The issue is whether it can be argued, and I'm going to tell you it really can't. Why? In a paper of any reasonable length, it would have to overcome so many things that we believe. So you'd have to convince me that there's a definition of alien that octopus fits under. You'd have to convince me that octopuses are unlike all other life on the planet. That's going to take a whole lot of arguing. So we're talking several large books just to get us to the point where you accept that octopuses are unlike all other life on the planet in a definition that helps them to be aliens. That's not going to work. So this is not something that can be argued. Here's another good one that could be argued. So we saw this last week. We worked through some of the details. Teachers in Hokkaido should use ICT to provide remote classroom instruction in order to increase the education level of remote schools and connect large schools with small schools. So it was on English Education Hokkaido, ICT, and remote schools. Again, we want to look at this particular thesis. We want to apply the same 4 steps that we looked at before. First, we want to define terms clearly. Second, we want to structure the argument correctly. Third, we want to look at what we have to show as a fact, so the empirical things we want to check. And fourth, we want to put the conclusion in. So here we have 3 terms we need to be clear on: ICT, education level, remote school. We also have a term we need to be very careful about, which is should. So by should, do we mean this is moral, or do we mean this is the best tool available for improvement? Probably in this case, I think you're better off going with best available tool for improvement. Maybe you could argue that schools should be improved on a moral level, but here the question is more of the sort, should we use a screwdriver or a hammer to put a nail in the wall? So we'll need to check, this is our 3rd step, whether ICT usage increases education level. And then if that's the case, we have an argument with all the pieces in play for the conclusion that then we should use ICT for remote schools. So we'll look at 1 or 2 more, and hopefully that'll be enough to get you started. Here's one that would have to be argued because it's not well accepted. So private international schools in Japan should be government-run international schools. We're going to have to define what a private international school is. So that's a little bit harder than it might seem. There's probably a lot of things that would qualify as private international schools depending on the definition. Second, we'll have to see, what does government run mean? Does government run mean the government makes every choice? Does government run mean the government picks the people that make the choices? There's some give here where we have to make it clear. Again, there's a should be as well, and this is the biggest question here. Why should they be run by the government? We'd have to know, is this for the society's benefit? Is this for the best educational outcomes? So then we're going to ask a couple of questions as the things that will make this a workable thesis. How might this change benefit society? Then, can we find evidence, or stage 3? What can be a true or false thing we're looking for when we research? And finally, we're going to try to prove the schools should be government run. And if we can show that there is sufficient benefit, we will have made our argument if we define should be as having that sort of benefit, and if we're clear about what qualifies as these schools. So how does this relate to the entire writing process? The answer is similar to what you saw in the last flip. So the preliminary argument outlined before most of the research tells you what to look for to make your longer argument and make it succeed. This is helpful because this helps you avoid wasting time reading parts of a text that are not useful for the argument for your thesis. At this point, you want to discover whether or not you can argue for your thesis statement. It is okay that you've not proven your premises true or false yet. So you just want to be clear on what your premises are, and you want to use the process of researching to solve that. But here, before you start researching, you want to know, what do I need to prove true or false, so you can spend all of your research time looking for things that matter. During your research, you can begin to test that argument. You can see whether the thesis statement that you made and the premises that support it are going to work. So as you learn more, you may need to adapt your argument if some premises are false. So sometimes this is easy. Sometimes you can solve things pretty easily just by slipping in a different premise. So earlier we had one where you're looking for, was it 11%? Maybe you can switch that down to an 8% gain. Maybe you can explain why that's an okay standard. Some things are not going to be so easy. So sometimes you will have to abandon your argument if key claims fail or if you cannot support your thesis statement. So this is a sad part of research that we all face, is sometimes you start writing something and then you realize you can't defend that. That's fine. That's part of how we learn. But the point is that if you structure things well, you won't have wasted as much time because you will be able to focus on the things that matter for the claims you wanted to make. So after you do your research, think about whether or not you need to revise the thesis statement and or refine your argument. These changes can be small or large. Some of them will mean changing major sections of your paper. Some will mean some minor tweaks. But both of these are quite useful things. Once you have your research at hand, you can help refine that argument and just give it a better structure than it even had when you started. So finally, when you're done writing, check the thesis statement. Make sure the contents match. Check if all the premises and conclusions are there and that they prove the thesis statement you wanted. If there's any claim that you didn't prove, add that argument into your paper. If you made any important on-topic argument in the paper that was not in the thesis statement, make sure it connects back in. Add it into the thesis somehow. If you ran out of time to include arguments that you had promised in the thesis statement, remove them. So simplify your paper down to what you were actually able to prove. So thank you for watching this flip about academic writing. If you enjoyed this, please leave a comment. If you're taking the class, please feel free to ask questions in class or via email. I do hope that you are learning. There are further flips before this. There will be more coming after this. There's also another set of flips on critical thinking that you are free to view at your leisure. So whatever time it is, I do hope that you are having a good time.